Hi everyone, and welcome to week 10, crazy that it's week 10, of Diagnosis and Intervention. This week we're looking at spelling instruction. We'll look specifically at what developmentally appropriate spelling instruction is and what it isn't. We will look at assessments that you can use to see where a student is as a speller, and then we'll consider interventions from your textbook as ways to support a speller no matter what level or area that they're working within. I originally posted this chart as a keynote chart, and just like every other week in this class, I wanted to use a different format for you all so that you can experience that as both a student and as a possible teaching tool for you to use in your own class. Keynote is Apple's answer to PowerPoint. It's very similar to PowerPoint, but it might be, from my perspective, a little bit easier to embed video and audio and to make really beautiful, visually appealing slides. So if you want to play around with Keynote, go ahead and do that. I think it's a nice chart, a nice way to provide information to your students, especially upper elementary and middle school students. I then pulled that chart into Notability, so you can see here that I'm writing on this chart within Notability, so it also can be exported as a PDF for the ease of you and your younger learners. So I've assumed here that prior to coming into this screencast, you have engaged in your readings. You'll notice that the chapter for this week focuses on phonics and spelling. And if you have had me for phonics before, the components of the chapter that have to do with phonics instruction should be very much review. If you haven't had me before, then hopefully that will give you an overview of sort of the relationship between letters and sounds, which is phonics, and then that would lead right into the components we will be focusing on this week, which are all about spelling and spelling instruction. Now that you've done that reading, you'll engage here in the screencast. I will guide you through activities, talk you through the choice board options for the week, and then you can finally engage in the quiz that I've posted to Moodle to check your content knowledge and make sure we are all on the same page. We're going to begin by talking about what developmentally appropriate spelling instruction is and what it is not. So when we think about the terms developmentally appropriate, it means that we are thinking about what is the best practice for our young learners from elementary school through middle school. What's an appropriate way based on how they're developing, how they're growing, how they're learning to provide them with spelling instruction? Because we know that there are really sound best practice ways to teach our students, and then there are ways that may be traditional and ways that have been passed down to instruct, but maybe aren't as developmentally appropriate as they could be based on where our learners are. So what spelling instruction that's developmentally appropriate is not may sound a little familiar to you depending on your own experiences with spelling instruction. It is not considered developmentally appropriate spelling instruction to provide all of the students in your class with the same list of spelling words that you test them on at the beginning and the end of the week, no matter where they are as readers and writers. What we know about this and why it's not developmentally appropriate, even though it's a very popular thing to do, is that if this right here is your word list as far as difficulty, you've got a lot of students who have already passed that. So this word list is going to be way too easy for them. They're not learning anything from it. You've also got students who haven't quite made it to that point in their spelling or their orthographic knowledge yet. So this spelling list is going to be too hard. So it's sort of like a Goldilocks moment. The only piece of this the only students who are going to benefit from this particular spelling list are those right there in the middle where you can catch that that's actually their spelling needs. But you've got all these students working above that level or who haven't made it to that level yet, and they are not benefiting from a one-size-fits-all spelling approach. So we want to stay away from word lists where we're giving every child in the class the same word list, because it's only going to help a select few of students, and we want any instructional time that we are using to be appropriate for every learner that we're working with. We also don't want our spelling instruction to be competitive. We don't want students to be comparing their scores on a test to other scores. We know that children develop at different rates, at different paces, in lots of areas of their academics. So comparing a student's spelling scores from one to the other really can hurt feelings, and it also is not very indicative of that student's actual learning. So we want to make sure that the instruction we are doing spelling-wise does not compare all students to one list and create a competitive atmosphere, because again, all students progress at different paces, at different rates in their academics, and spelling is no different than any other area. So instead of all the things over here that we do not want to do, we're going to focus some time on what we do want our developmentally appropriate spelling instruction to be like, and what we want it to do for our students. So developmentally appropriate spelling instruction is going to include individuals working with a teacher or small groups of students working with the teacher. Because we don't want the same list of words or the same group of words for every student in the class, you group your students based on what they're working on. So maybe this group right here is working on the all word family, and they are sorting words that have all in them, like small, ball, fall, call, and they're looking for that pattern within all of their words. Maybe after this group moves through with the teacher, another group comes and they're working on the IGHT word family. So they're sorting maybe IGHT words and ITE words. So they might have night, they might have kite, light, bite, and they've got these on cards, and they're sorting them into groups. This helps kids to see how spelling patterns, even if we hear the same sounds, ite and ite, will look different in orthography. Orthography is just a fancy pants way of saying the actual conventional spelling patterns. So this word night and light, those two words, have the orthographic pattern of IGHT, and kite and bite have the orthographic pattern of ITE. So you might have a group that's working on those comparisons. And then you might, after that group works with the teacher for a while, you might have another group come and maybe they're working on short A words because that's where they are as spellers and as learners. So we want our spelling instruction to be right within each child's ZPD. So they're working just above what they could do by themselves with the support of a teacher. So they're working within that ZPD. And as we know, if we're doing that in a developmentally appropriate way, we aren't going to have the same word list for all of our students. We will have individuals and small groups working on different orthographic patterns or spelling patterns in words because that's where they are as learners. So that's what developmentally appropriate spelling instruction should look like. It should look individualized, just like all the other content that we teach students in our classrooms. It should be differentiated based on where they are as spellers and as learners. So I was using on the last slide the terms orthographic patterns. So as I said, orthography is just a fancy word for talking about spelling of words that is conventional. So it's the way words are spelled in books, the conventional spelling. The orthography of a word is not invented spelling. It's not when students are just thinking about the sounds they hear. Orthography is when we look at how that word is conventionally spelled, what it looks like in books. And the reason we want to talk about patterns with kids is because oftentimes, if we're teaching kids to memorize spelling rules, like I before E except after C, Or when two vowels go walking, the first one does the talking. There are always going to be words that break those rules. And so it's much better to teach kids about patterns, things that usually happen, than to tell them the rule. Because when you say something is a rule to a child, they believe it will always be true. So if we teach patterns, then we can teach students that there are often similarities across words. We can see patterns in how they're spelled. But that gives students the freedom to recognize when something doesn't fit the pattern. That's okay, because we aren't telling them that spelling is all memorization or rules based. This will really help them when they're thinking about the times when letters don't fit the pattern or the rule that we typically think they would. And this can happen in multiple languages. Your book talks about it from the perspective of English, obviously, and also Spanish, because there are so many Spanish speakers in the United States. And they give a couple of examples in your book. For instance, in both of those languages, one phoneme or a sound, phoneme is a fancy word for sound, can be represented by more than one letter, or one grapheme, another fancy word for letter. So the examples that are given are that in Spanish, the x phoneme, and I use those brackets to show that that's a sound, can be a few different letters. It can be the G making that sound, it can be the J making that sound, or it can be an X making that sound. So one phoneme, x, x, is represented by multiple letters. That can also happen, obviously, in the English language. If we have the k phoneme, there's my brackets, then we might see the k phoneme with a C, a K, or sometimes together, the CK together. So that's important for students to know that there isn't a set rule for exactly what letter makes that sound. Similarly, one letter can have more than one sound. So one phoneme or one sound can be represented by more than one letter, or one letter can have more than one sound. In English, an example of this might be the letter G. The letter G can say g, 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 like in gate, or it can say j, 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 like giraffe. All right, so that happens in English in letters like the letter G. In Spanish, this can happen too, also with the letter G. So if we've got the letter G in Spanish, sometimes it says g, 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 like gato for cat, but G can also make the phoneme x, x, as we talked about over here. So we want students to understand and be flexible with the sounds they think letters make and with the letters that make particular sounds. And that's true across multiple languages, both Spanish and English, which we often hear in schools. All right, so that's it as far as the content that I'm going to deliver to you this week. There's more in your chapter, but those were points I wanted to highlight from your chapter. The rest of the time that you're going to be working for this week will be independent work and work with a peer or a partner or even a student if you do this screencast early enough and you're going out to clinicals. And so you're going to just engage with this content more fully on your own from this point on. The first way you're going to engage is to think about stages of spelling, which is going to be activity 1. In your book on pages 116 to 118, the spelling stages that DeVries has outlined are discussed and described. So you can see we go from the emergent to the alphabetic to the within word pattern, syllables and affixes, and derivational. So these stages of spelling are slightly different than other stages of spelling that other theorists and researchers have come up with, but you'll notice that as you read about each spelling stage, similar things are occurring. There's a trajectory of spelling improvement or skills that are happening that happen in particular ways. So what I want you to do for this Stages of Spelling activity is to use your text, pages 116 to 118. Read about each of these stages, the emergent stage and on down. And you're going to write on this chart, so you can just screenshot it once you're done filling it out, an instructional strategy that your book talks about related to that particular stage. And then your book also, in the same section, gives some really specific advice for English language learners who are within this stage. So whatever specifics your book talks about for ELL students, you want to also name some of those. So you'll have an instructional strategy that is very helpful and useful for a student in the emergent spelling stage. And then after you write your instructional strategy that's good for all learners in that stage, you'll write a little bit about the specifics to support an English language learner who's in the emergent spelling stage. Then you'll go to alphabetic, and you'll do the same thing based on what DeVries is telling you in the text on pages 116 to 118. After you've filled this out, then you'll screenshot it and upload it to Activity 1 on Moodle. And then we get to what I think is a pretty interesting, engaging activity. I said at the beginning of the screencast, you would not only think about developmentally appropriate spelling, what it looks like, and also obviously some instructional strategies for working with spellers at each stage of spelling. Oh, and by the way, just so you know, after the derivational stage, that's when we get to the fluent stage of spelling, and this is when students are very familiar with the orthography of English if they're spelling words in English. And again, that's the conventional spelling of words. So all of these spelling stages lead to kids being fluent spellers, and they understand conventional spelling and orthography. So not only were we going to look, I said at the outset of the screencast, at developmentally appropriate spelling and instructional strategies to support this, but we also were going to look at how you assess and find where a student is. Because if we're saying we need to be working in small groups with our learners as they go through spelling stages, then we also need to be thinking about how we get the data to determine where they are as spellers. So that's what we're doing here. For activity number 2, you're going to choose an assessment. DeVries has 2 excellent assessments. One is a spelling inventory, which is written about on pages 124 through 125, and you also have some appendices that you can go to see examples of what this looks like. Or you're going to choose to look at and read about the CAFE assessment, which is on page 125. I'm not going to describe these to you because you can read about them and see what it is that you'll do for each assessment. Whichever one of these sounds the most fun to you, you're going to deliver one of these assessments to either a peer, so you would just find somebody who you could do this with, staying socially distanced, obviously, or a student. You get to decide. So if you do this in time to go out to clinicals and do it with a student, that would be great. Otherwise, you can do this with a peer, a family member, someone who you can actually give the assessment to. In order to deliver your chosen assessment, you've got to get it set up. So make sure your materials are ready. You have read very carefully what the spelling inventory or the CAFE assessment entails, and you know exactly how you would deliver that assessment. Be prepared, be ready to do so with materials and what you're going to say. Then actually deliver your chosen assessment to that peer or student. And as you're delivering it, collect data as you go. And there are data collection tools within DeVries that will help you, but you want to make sure you know how the student was doing in each of these assessments as you moved through it. And then you're going to respond in this way. So I don't need you to actually audio record or video record what you just did with that student or that peer. But I want you to use the data that you collect having done that assessment to respond to these questions. So I really want you to actually engage in that assessment. I know that since I'm not collecting the audio recording or the video, that you might think about, maybe not actually doing it with a peer or a student, but I really need you to so you can get actual real data so you can respond to these questions. So if you chose the spelling inventory, what did you learn about your peers or your students' spelling stage? So based on their responses to the spelling inventory, and if you are working with peers, you might encourage them to make some mistakes as they go. If you did the spelling inventory, what stages of spelling or stage of spelling was your student or your peer in? And then based on that, what might this person be ready for next? So, hope I'm not making you seasick here. If you said that your student or your peer was at the within word pattern stage based on their responses, then you might think about what instructional strategies you could use with that student to bring them to the next level as spellers, and that's what you would write about there. If you chose the cafe assessment, you have different questions. The first is, what did you learn about your peers or students' orthographic knowledge, their conventional spelling knowledge? And then based on this, what might this person be ready for next? So similar but slightly different response for the cafe assessment. And then finally, after you've responded to the appropriate questions here, you'll identify and write about a spelling intervention that is based on the needs of this person. So it's essentially you're using your data here to answer questions about the stage your student is in, the orthographic knowledge your student or peer has, and then you're thinking about how would you intervene to support that student. You'll choose an intervention from pages 126 to 134 that you are choosing based on those needs. So if you noticed that your student was in the derivational spelling stage, for instance, then you would want to make sure you're choosing an intervention to support them that would help them work their way through the derivational spelling stage. All right, as usual, if you have questions about this, please don't hesitate to ask, but your responses to this will be uploaded to Activity 2 under Moodle for this week. All right, so we've moved through what developmentally appropriate spelling instruction is. Then we looked at how to give an assessment to determine what you would focus on with individual students as spellers. Then you looked at appropriate interventions based on a student's spelling progress. And that's led us basically through the content for this week. What you have left is to engage in your quiz, which is posted to Moodle, and also to consider how you're going to work through the choice board for this week. So let's go ahead and pull that up. The choice board for this week is made up of two options. So you only have two things you can do, one of which is pink. So if you haven't done a pink one or you need another, consider doing a pink option this week. Remember, you need two of them working with kids in order to meet that goal for this assignment. The first option for this spelling week is based on really just an intervention, so a support for a child. Create a grade-appropriate, content-related word wall on the iPad. Now, content-related word walls are word walls that would have to do with math or social studies or science content. And it's detailed on page 127 if you want some more information about content-related word walls. In order to create this, I want you to use a combination of audio, video, text, and visuals. So however you get this to me, make sure that you can combine audio, video, text, and visuals. After you create this word wall that's grade appropriate and content related, you'll write an accompanying reflection to discuss how the chosen words fit into your grade level's curriculum and content. A good way to defend why you chose particular content words, again, those are math, science, and social studies focused. A good way to defend the ones you chose would be to show how they come up in the standards for your clinical grade level. So you want to choose words that kids are going to encounter as learners in this grade level. So that's a way to attack that. That's a way to look at this particular spelling option. If you have questions, let me know. The second option here is, again, very familiar at this point because it's very similar to the ones that you've done in past weeks. If you choose the pink, you're going to conduct an informal assessment, which we've just talked about, and you've done at least one of them, the spelling inventory or the cafe assessment, with one student. This time it has to be a student. If you used a peer before, then you've got to actually work with a clinical student this time. Identify and write about one area of success and one area of challenge. So using the results of your assessment, what was an area where your student did really well, and what's an area where they still need some work? Based on the challenge that they faced, identify an appropriate intervention from examples in the textbook. And those are on the pages that I talked about earlier in the screencast. You can find the section on interventions in your textbook. And you'll find one that, based on the challenge, would be a good next step for this student, and then justify why it's appropriate. And when I say you want to use data to show why it's appropriate, I mean data from the results of the assessment. So your data is, well, on the spelling inventory, my student only was able to spell 1 out of 4 long vowel sound words. That's your data. They could spell 1 out of 4 long vowel sound words. And so I found an intervention that would help them to focus on and learn more about long vowels. So you want to use your data, use what the student did and where they faced a challenge in the assessment to justify why your intervention you chose is appropriate for them. All right. So just to recap very quickly, you've done your readings. Now you've listened to your screencast and know what your activities are. You have a quiz that you can complete on Moodle, and then a choice board activity that you will do with a student out in clinicals, or if you chose the non-pink option, that you'll just need to be thinking about standards and content-specific words that you could create a word wall using. As always, now that we've moved online especially, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out over email, or we could set up a Zoom session to talk through anything you are confused on or want some more clarity regarding. So please let me know. I hope y'all are having a good week, and congratulations to making it to week 10.